Good morning. It is so good to be with you in person. It has been a week for my family. Yesterday we had the joy of watching fireworks, which I have to remember when you're 7 and 9 years old and as a kid is like the greatest thing on the planet, but as a parent, it's a very different posture. They like to get as close to the fireworks as possible. And luckily we went away unscathed, but it was a lot of fun. I got in a car after fireworks and started the drive, which is a harrowing drive. Especially without air conditioning. Our car's air conditioning decided to quit on me. So I drove part of the way last night to Kansas City and then drove the rest of the way. And now I know what it's like. So I've done it before. We can do it as a family. It would be great. Man, it is good to be here. I'm excited to preach this text. It's you've heard it. Eric just said to me, high drama, which this story is high drama. A lot is happening. There's a reason why I think sometimes preachers skip over this one because it deals with some really heavy things, demons and a man who's walking in the tombs, who's cutting himself with stones. I mean, it's very graphic in nature. But I think there's something really, really powerful. In fact, the past few weeks that I've been able to preach with you, we've talked about Jesus' power. First, we see his power in relation to disease and sickness. And then we saw Jesus and his power over creation with the hurricane and the boat. And this week, we're going to see Jesus' power over evil in the spiritual world. This is one of the most vivid and detailed accounts in the book of Mark, but it's also one of the most vivid accounts of an exorcism of a demon. And that's kind of an intense subject, but I think hopefully this will be helpful in understanding what's really going on here. And so let's start at the top. Jesus gets out of the boat. A man with an evil spirit comes from the tombs to meet him. And I think when we come across a story like this, I think it's really natural for being contemporary Western people to kind of be skeptical about the spiritual world. The devil, demons, are they just metaphor? And so I want to share just a few things out of the gate and ask the question, why not believe in the devil and demons? I think there's one very crucial point that we sometimes miss, and that's this. Jesus very much believed in the devil. The Greek word for devil is diabolos, and the root word literally means slanderer or accuser. And the word devil is actually just one of the words that we see all throughout the scriptures. You've heard the great dragon or the Satan or the evil one, the deceiver, the serpent, right? Important to note, these are titles, not names. Okay, even the word Satan is not the devil's first name, right? That's a title that's given to describe this being. And to Jesus, this being is one of the most powerful people in the cosmos. And he's the real intelligence behind so much of the evil in our society. And if you don't believe in evil in our society, I mean, you watch the news and you see evil all around us. Evil exists. It's there, it's real, and it's something that we cannot ignore. And so for Jesus, the devil is not just a myth, it's not just a metaphor, it's a real personal being. Not a figment of an imagination, not something in the pre-scientific age, not a red cartoon with a pitchfork and a tail, right? But something very real. And so I know the temptation to think like, well, I like Jesus and his wisdom and his commands to love one another, but I'm not so sure about this devil stuff. This seems a little wonky. There's this guy by the name of Flynn, and there's this phenomenon described called the Flynn effect. He's a sociologist from New Zealand. In the 80s, he popularized this idea called the Flynn effect that essentially his thesis was that as a society goes, that people actually become more intelligent. That we are much more intelligent, our IQ is much higher today than it was back 2,000 years ago. Since then, the Flynn effect has been thoroughly debunked. Every sociologist worth their salt, including one of the more popular podcasts by Malcolm Gladwell. I don't know if you've listened to that episode, where he talks about how we are actually no smarter today than we were 2,000 years ago. Now, we have more access to information. We have the internet, ChatGPT. We have the ability to know things like this, but that does not actually make us any smarter. But this idea kind of went off in the Western world because, there's a sort of progressive understanding of how the world works, that we're ahead of the narrative arc of human history, right? So conservatives, by definition, are behind the narrative arc, right? And progressives are ahead of the human arc. And so it just kind of fit right in that we're smarter than ever before. But the reality is that's just not true. And we kind of fall into this temptation of what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery. And I think what I would invite you to consider this morning is that Jesus' view of reality is, in fact, a true and valid view. And we need to take this very seriously. It was C.S. Lewis, and I'm going to paraphrase him here, but he essentially said there are two opposite errors that we can fall into in relation to the devil. Either we become obsessed with the devil in the spiritual world, and we think there's a devil under every rock, or we don't believe that he exists. And both of them can be dangerous. Now, the understanding in this passage about demons is a complex one. Matthew 4, Matthew's account, and even before that, Matthew 4:24, you read about the news of Jesus spreading, and people are bringing him ill people, sick people, demon-possessed, lunatics, the paralyzed, and all these people Jesus is healing. Now here's what's interesting. Matthew does not attribute in there diseases to demon-possessed people. They are two separate things. They knew the difference between a psychological disorder and someone who is demonized. Right? So there was a clear delineation between the two things. The writers of scriptures understood that. And the scriptures are going to show you four different elements that are kind of interlocking that work in a person's life in different forms. And I think this is why this is such a complexity to evil. So let me show you just a few of these. 1 Timothy, Paul says, if you're proud, you fall into the trap of the devil. How many of you struggle with pride? You don't have to raise your hand, you can if you want. How many of you struggle with pride? How many of you struggle with being bitter towards someone? Right, in Ephesians, Paul says if you're bitter, if you hold a grudge, you fall under the influence of the devil. This suggests that according to the scriptures, that demonic forces stir up and aggravate all the other factors that mess up your life. But the devil is in the details, as they say, and tries to work in ways in which we're always constantly under a battle of unseen forces in the world. And this is why our psychological and emotional traumas are so complicated, right? They're so deep because they're so entrenched with so many things that we don't fully understand. Now, the second thing here the text tells us is how this pattern of evil actually works out in life. And I think part of the problem we run into is that the English translation of demon-possessed isn't actually a fair representation of what's happening here. The Greek words used to describe demon-possessed in the New Testament is actually more likely, or more clearly defined as demonized. Someone who is demonized. We often think of demon possession, we think of movies, right, or television shows where demons are depicted as taking over someone's body, and it's very sensationalized and scary. But the reality is the word here is to be demonized. Paul says, if you're proud, if you're bitter, if you're self-centered, that even in those things, you are opening yourself to the influence of evil forces that are wanting to destroy what God has brought together. The evil one wants to destroy what God has brought together and to pull it apart. And when you, according to Paul, are in any way proud or selfish or do anything like that to some degree, you are being influenced. So what is this pattern? What do we see here? We're going to see it in our story. Let's take a look at it. Now, this is a very vivid depiction. The man lived in the tombs. It says no one could bind him, meaning no one could hold him, right? He was strong. And he had a chain, it said he'd broken his chains apart, broke the irons of his feet. This is a man who is clearly very unwell. It said he was strong enough to subdue him day and night. No one was strong enough to subdue him day and night in the tombs, and he would cry out and cut himself with stones. So it's sort of self-harm, self-mutilation. Now, I want you to consider something here. When you make a pact with evil, there's an exchange that happens, right? On one hand, this man has great power. It says no one could bind him. People are trying to hold him down, and yet he is breaking free. He's ripping chains. This man has great power. At the same time, the man is a slave to the evil. He does not want to be where he's at. He's not happy in his life. He's miserable. He's in despair. He's walking among the tombs because he can't be around anyone else. And so on one hand, he's being eaten alive from the inside, disintegrating because of the evil. But on the other hand, it contains great power. This is the temptation. I don't know if you're familiar with something called a Faustian myth. It's a German story about how you hear these stories about making deals with the devil, right? You agree that you'll receive something, some kind of great power, and in response you sell your soul to the devil. There's an exchange that takes place. So let's take this down to earth to understand it. If you make anything more important in your life, whether that's your self-image, your self-worth, your happiness, your wealth, whatever it might be, more important than Jesus, all of a sudden, you find yourself with a new master. You've made a pact with that thing. You can say, well, I believe in Jesus, I believe in God, but the moment you make something and elevate something above God, you are making a kind of pact and giving it a certain amount of power. What is the real thing that your heart centers on? What is the real reason you get up in the morning? What is really driving you and motivating you in your life? Whatever it is, there's an exchange that's taking place. The person who seeks power, controlled by power. The person who seeks acceptance, controlled by people's opinion of them and how they're perceived. And while we may think that we are in charge of our life, the reality is we are so giving up something of ourselves and we are no longer in control of who we are. If we can only have the thing that we long for, then we'll be happy. Let me give you an example. Okay, and there are many examples we could use for this, but let's take one that I think many of us could maybe resonate with, and that would be your career. If your career is your main fuel in your life, the driving force in going up in the corporate ladder and moving up in the world, and this is the reason you get up in the morning, if that's what you're really after, then on one hand, it's going to give you power. You'll be driven, probably more driven than other people in your field, because you've made a deal that this is the most important thing in your life. And for you, it's everything. But on the other hand, while you have this power, you also have this yoke of slavery. The tendency will be to take your career and put it above anything else in this world. And in doing so, there are lots of things that can happen. You may trample people on your way up, exploit people who are vulnerable. Secondly, there's a possibility that you'll cut ethical corners, do whatever it takes to get ahead. Whatever in the short run matters, but ultimately in the long run, you find yourself disintegrating inside. You put your career over your relationships with your spouse, with your kids. You find yourself getting home at the end of the day, working hard, so hard to accomplish whatever means they are, and then you find yourself so numb to the world around you that all you can do is scroll on your phone and sort of disappear. Everything takes a back seat once you've made that deal. And so all of your joy and meaning comes from your success. This is the Faustian bargain. Are you seeing that? The deal you're making is saying, with this thing that is going to make me whole and complete to give me power, but in some ways you become a slave to it. I want to suggest to you this morning that I think in some ways, we might be more like the man in the tombs than we'd like to believe. We may have more in common with this man who I know is described in kind of a scary way with walking around, cutting himself with stones and chains on his arms. But we may be more like him than we'd like to think. We're in the process of moving, which is fun. We've been in this house for almost 10 years, and we're in the purge phase where we realize that you don't realize how much stuff you can pile until you realize you're going to have to move all of it. And so we got a quote for these little pods that they're going to drop off at our house, and we'll load them up. And as we're looking at all the stuff in our house, we're like, it can't be good that we need like 3 of these things, right? That's unhealthy. And so we got a dumpster and we're throwing stuff away and we're realizing there's just so much stuff that compiles and kids' toys and boxes that from the last time we moved that we've never opened, right? So much stuff that we're just moving for the sake of moving. But I think this is kind of how the devil works in our lives. It's not a literal physical, I'm gonna shake hands with the devil. No, it's slowly, gradual, over time, one decision at a time, one mistake at a time. And over time you don't realize how far you've gone until you're in the tombs and you are a demonized person. Slowly, things change. The work of evil is slow, bit by bit. Doesn't come to you and say, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna make you obsess over your work, that you're gonna neglect your family, that you're gonna neglect your spiritual life, and that you're gonna neglect all the things that really matter. I'm gonna make you so obsessed with your wealth. No, he doesn't say that to you. He tempts you one little thing at a time. So there's a complexity to evil. There's a strategy of the evil one to get you to that place slowly over time. But ultimately, this is a story of hope. So there's the bad news. Let me tell you some of the good news. The good news of this story is that evil can be defeated. A major part of the gospel, which John wrote in his first epistle, he said, the reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the works of the devil. We just sang a little bit ago, no power in hell, right? Now let me show you something really profound. You can go all the way back to the very beginning of the scriptures to see the gospel preached. In Genesis 3, he's cursing the serpent, right? What does he say to the serpent? Because you have done all this, cursed are you above all livestock, all wild animals. You will crawl on your belly, you will eat dust all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers. And then he says this line, which is so profound. He says, he will crush your head and you will strike his heel. Friends, this is the euangelion, the very first preaching of the gospel. That the reason Jesus came to earth was to destroy the works of the devil. Yes, the devil is going to strike his heel. He's going to put him on a cross. But in the great twist, it's actually the cross that has power. And in Jesus on the cross, he crushes the devil's head. It is through the cross that we can destroy evil. So how do we do that? What does that even mean? Well, first we defeat evil by recognizing the source of power to defeat evil and connecting to that power. Why do you think when he saw Jesus from a distance, this man ran to him, right? Sprinted to him. We look at this, a man who is possessed by a legion of demons. And a legion is a Roman word that means something like 6,000. In the days of Julius Caesar, it would have been 3,500. But in the Roman Empire, it could have been 8,000, so thousands of demons. And yet, this man, possessed by legion, gets to the presence of God, and there is no struggle. He goes straight to his knees. And the most interesting thing is that Jesus says to him, come out. It's simple. Think a few weeks ago, what does he say to the hurricane? Be quiet. There's no magic trick, no incantation. He doesn't roll up his sleeves. He simply says, come out. Interesting that when Jesus was with the disciples on the boat, do you remember the question, one of the questions they asked at the end? They said, who is this man? It's interesting to me that the demons, the thousands of demons, don't ask that question. They know very well who this man is. Right, they get there and they realize, it even says in the text, this is the Son of God, right? Naming the fact that real power is standing before them and the demons are terrified. And it's interesting, we have all these historical records of exorcisms, not from the scriptures. Like in old Egyptian literature, there's actually all these examples of exorcisms, but in every case of an exorcism, you will see a calling to a higher power. So they will say, in the name of whoever it might be, release this devil. But in this case, this is maybe the only case where Jesus doesn't call on a higher power. He simply says, come out. It's actually unprecedented. There's nothing like it anywhere else in any ancient literature. And it's almost comedic because when the man comes running, what does he do? He falls down and he says, "What do you want with me? Jesus, Son of the Most High, in God's name, don't torture me." What does the demon do? Tries to exorcise Jesus. You see that? He says, "In God's name, don't torture me." Doesn't work out for him. It's actually, as they're trying to exorcise Jesus, he simply acknowledges the reality that he himself is power himself, power over evil, and all he has to do is say, "Leave." And so with that, we have this reality that we have to acknowledge. Jesus is not merely a rabbi. He's not just a great teacher. He's not just a great healer. No, Jesus is Yahweh in the flesh. He is power himself. And even though you have a legion of 6,000 people negotiating with Jesus, the legion has to get permission to do anything. And so it's not a struggle. Jesus casts a demon out because he's got the power. And then you get the pigs. Now, I got to be honest with you. I don't know if this was the best use of my time because I probably spent, 4 or 5 hours working on this sermon, but I spent 12 hours researching pigs in the ancient world. I got obsessed with it. And I hate to say it, I spent so much time and got very little information. But here's what I got. I went on some real rabbit trails. There are some things in common. One, most scholars come to the same conclusion. They're like, this is such a weird story. It has to be true. Because there's no reason they would include this in the scriptures if it was untrue. It's such a bizarre story. And when you think about 2,000 pigs, that's not a small amount of pigs. The second consensus they had was nobody really knows what's going on and how the spirit relates to bodies. We kind of have an understanding, but it's kind of ambiguous on how that actually works. But we do know this in Matthew. They say, you don't have a right to torture us before the time. Okay, this isn't mentioned in Mark, but in Matthew, the demons say, you don't have a right to torture us before it's time. Which is interesting, because as we keep reading in the New Testament and you get to the book of Revelation, we find out that there's going to come a day when the ultimate infinite torture is going to happen of the evil spiritual world. Right? There's a time coming when evil will be banished in its entirety. And we have the new heaven and the new world. And so with that, what do? Jesus says, no human host for you, go to the pigs. And remember, in this time, in this day and age, there wasn't this like sentimental, like, you remember the movie Babe? The little pig that's cute. Honestly, I don't even remember what happened in that movie, but I remember the cute pig. There's no sentimentality here. Okay, pigs were not cute. In fact, what they were, and what's important to this story is that they would have been worth a lot of money. So when you see 2,000 pigs running into the sea, you can imagine people, the pig farmers, being like, that's a lot of money that we are losing right now. And I think one of the interesting points here is that Jesus is saying there is no amount of wealth in the world worth a single human soul. Even this man in the tomb, let's throw all the pigs, all 2,000 of them, however hundreds of thousands of dollars that is, not worth it. All of your wealth is not worth losing your soul over. So Jesus has the power to cast out demons. With that, how do you and I connect with this? What does it mean for us? The Jews at the time considered their source or their enemy, the source of all their problems, to be the Romans. And as far as where the Jews were concerned, the Romans were considered unclean pigs. Like, they actually used that language. And so the best thing you could do in their mind for the Jews, if you're the Messiah, was to come and overthrow the Romans, and likely done so with the sword. That was their hope, and their messianic expectation is that he would come and make that change and take over the Romans. And the best thing you could do was go to a region like the Jaderstons, right, where the Gentiles were at and the Romans were at, was part of the Decapolis, where they would raise pigs. This is where that region is to go in there and to take over and go on the offensive. But what does Jesus do? He goes there, where the Gentiles are, where the Romans are, and instead of coming with the sword, he heals a Gentile man. See, here's the problem with calling somebody evil. to say the Romans are evil, to say they are the source of all their problems, to say they are the evil ones, say if we just change this form of government, if we just change the way we think about these things, then everything will be made right. But the reality is, Jesus doesn't do that. He goes there to show us that actually it's the legions, it's the principalities and powers that are causing problems in our world. It's the unseen world that are inside of us. And by healing a Gentile man, I think he's trying to draw the line between the fact that good and evil go right down the center of every human heart. That all of us are in desperate need of healing. So I think we need to be very careful. I think we need to be careful to point out who and what is evil. Be very careful that we have actually a lot more in common with the man in chains than we realize. Be very careful about saying, well, I'm good, I have it figured out. They need help, they're evil, they're broken. But be more like the man who cried out, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. Because I think we have more in common with the man in chains than we realize. So what do we do? What do we do about evil? You see, when Jesus went into that realm, he healed that man, and you notice when he's all done, it says he was clothed and he was in his right mind and he was sitting there, which is such a beautiful picture. Right, we have this picture of a man with ripped clothes who was cutting himself, who was in chains, and it says after he was healed, he was restored. He had good clothing on. He was totally restored as a person. And at the end of the book of Mark, we're going to see Jesus exchanging places with this man in a sense. Jesus, at the end of Mark, is naked, stripped of his clothing. At the end of Mark, Jesus crying out and bleeding. At the end of Mark, he's driven into the tombs, to a tomb. That's how Jesus ultimately dealt with evil, not with the sword, but by going to the cross. And while they had wanted him to go and start a rebellion, the reality is this: there may have been a little bit of political liberation for a short amount of time, but instead Jesus Christ did as he went to the cross and absorbed evil and injustice and sin and death unto himself. So that instead of us receiving the penalty for sin, he took it on himself so that we may have life and be free. And when you see the cost of being willing to go to death on our behalf, it's only when we fully understand that, when we fully get the gravity of what Jesus has done for us, that we can realize the extent of his grace and mercy and love for you and for I. That at cost that was paid, the infinite cost to defeat evil, was a great one. When we get that, then the pacts that we make, whether that's with our career is just a career. Our reputation, just our reputation. Our appearance, it's just our appearance. The wealth we accumulate, the stuff we accumulate over time, it's just stuff. Because we understand there's a greater reality to this world. And then Jesus sends the man out, what? Fully restored, back into his own land as a vehicle of an agent of redemption and healing. And he says, go back to your people. It's interesting at the end, he wants to go with Jesus. He's like, thanks for healing me, can I come with you? And Jesus is like, no, go and tell everyone what has happened. An encouragement for us to tell others that we have been healed and saved. Who we once were is no longer who we are. And so hear the good news that Jesus today has triumphed over evil, that we are more sinful and flawed and more like the man in the tombs than maybe we'd like to believe. Yet at the same time, we are more loved and accepted in Jesus Christ than we ever dared hope. Will you pray with me? Lord, help us. Help us to be and pray the prayer of the man who says, have mercy on me, a sinner. We thank you that you have defeated evil. We thank you that you help us to understand the power and the complexity of it, that not any of us are too far away from allowing the influence of evil in our own life. But help us by the power of your Spirit, Jesus. And as we participate now in the Lord's Supper, make what your Son did to defeat evil for us real to us, that evil can be defeated as we contemplate his dying love for us on the cross. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.